The floor crushed downward at 40% gravity compression the moment Queen Velith stepped through the archway. She had expected resistance. She had not expected the walls themselves to groan. The training facility on Earth's northern compound had been described to her in diplomatic briefs as rigorous. That word, she now understood, was a translation failure. The Terran language had no adequate equivalent for what humans apparently considered a standard morning workout. The compression plates beneath her six-limbed frame activated in sequence, each one adding weight, each one recalibrating based on her biometric readings. Her exoskeleton, evolved over 10,000 years of Velthara biology, strained in ways it had never strained on her homeworld. She smirked and stepped forward. Behind her, Commander Oren Vasquez watched from the observation rail. He was a compact man with grey at his temples and eyes that measured everything. He had spent 22 years training soldiers. He had never trained a queen. He had certainly never trained an alien queen who outmassed his best sergeant by 300 kilograms and who moved, even under compression, with the deliberate patience of a predator who had never needed to hurry. Compression at 60%, the floor system announced. The other trainees, 12 human soldiers in their third week of the advanced program, had stopped their own exercises. They stood at attention, technically, but their eyes betrayed them. They watched Queen Velith the way children watch a storm through a window. Fascinated. Afraid to look away. She did not acknowledge them. She walked the perimeter of the floor in long, measured strides, each footfall precise, each breath controlled. Her four upper limbs were folded behind her back in what Vasquez had been told was a posture of royal contemplation. Her two lower limbs, the ones that bore her weight, moved with mechanical grace across the compression plates. At 80% gravity, the system flagged a biometric anomaly. Vasquez checked his display. Her cardiovascular output had actually decreased. Not because she was struggling. Because she had slowed her heart rate voluntarily, conserving energy, redistributing strain across her muscle groups in a way the system had not been programmed to anticipate. He had been told she was a political figure, a symbolic leader, a ceremonial queen who had come to Earth on a diplomatic exchange as part of the new Unified Accord, the first formal treaty between humanity and the Velthari after 11 years of cold silence following the Karennis incident. Nobody had told him she had ever trained for anything. Compression at 100%, the floor announced. Maximum civilian threshold. The human soldiers around the room shifted their weight. At 100%, even the veterans felt the floor like a second body pressing them into the ground. Most civilians couldn't walk at that level. Most soldiers trained for months before completing a full circuit at maximum compression without assistance. Queen Velith paused at the center of the floor. She lowered herself into a rest position, not collapse, not surrender, but a deliberate crouch, her lower limbs folding beneath her, her upper limbs pressing flat against the plates. The compression system scanned her again. Vasquez watched the readout spike, recalibrate, and, then, produce a number he had to read twice. She was pushing back. Not fighting the floor. Not straining against it the way a human soldier would, muscles screaming, spine compressing, lungs working double time. She was using her own biology to generate counterpressure, redistributing her body mass with such precision that the compression plates were registering increased resistance from her body rather than decreased output from her system. She was making the floor work harder. Vasquez set down his display panel. He walked to the edge of the observation rail and leaned forward. He had a rule about not speaking during a floor exercise unless someone was in danger. He had a second rule about never letting a trainee see him surprised. He broke the second rule. He couldn't help it. One of the human soldiers, Private Dace, youngest on the floor, 3 weeks out of basic, took a single step toward the Queen. Not aggressive. Not defiant. Something younger and more dangerous than either. Curious. "Does it hurt?" the private asked. The question landed in the room like a stone in still water. Every soldier froze. Vasquez straightened. Protocol was absolute on the training floor. You did not speak without acknowledgement. You did not approach a diplomatic guest without clearance. You certainly did not ask a queen if something hurt. Queen Velith turned her head. Slowly. Deliberately. The way a mountain turns to look at a noise it finds interesting. She looked at Private Dace for a long moment. Her facial plates, the Velthari equivalent of a human face, layered chitin that shifted to express what their species would call emotion, moved in a configuration Vasquez had never seen in the diplomatic briefings. Later, when he reviewed the footage, He would identify it as the Velthari expression for something that translated, imperfectly, as recognition. She did not answer the question. She stood back up and walked toward the door marked Phase TWO. Phase 2 was not on the diplomatic itinerary. Vasquez caught up with her before she reached the door. He was not a small man and he moved fast, but she had longer legs and a head start, and he arrived at the threshold just as her lower limb pressed the access panel. "Your Majesty," he said. Not a command. An observation. She turned again. Same slowness. Same weight. Phase 2 is restricted to personnel who have completed a full certification cycle, he said. That is a 12-week minimum. It is not a political decision. It is a safety threshold. The injury rate for uncertified personnel in Phase 2 is 47%. She considered him. Her facial plate shifted again, this time into a configuration he recognized from the briefing materials. Amusement. Not cruelty. Something closer to the expression a chess grandmaster makes when an opponent finally plays an interesting move. "Commander Vasquez," she said. Her Terran was precise, accented in a way that made every syllable sound load-bearing. "I am aware of your injury rate." "Then, you understand why I can't authorize. I am also aware," she continued, "that your injury rate drops to 11% when a certified personnel leads the uncertified through Phase 2 as a paired unit." He stopped. She had read the internal research reports, the ones that hadn't been published, the ones that existed as internal proposals, still under review, not yet implemented because the political cost of changing a safety threshold midaccord was complicated and nobody wanted to start an argument with the Oversight Committee 6 weeks before treaty ratification. "Those reports," he said carefully, "are not public." "No," she agreed. "They are not." She waited. Her patience was not passive. It had texture and pressure, the same way the compression floor had texture and pressure. It was a thing that acted on the people around it. Vasquez looked at the door. He looked at her. He looked back at the 12 human soldiers who had followed them, not as a group, but, one by one, quietly, the way people follow something they can't stop watching. Private Dace was at the back. The youngest. The one who had asked the question. "Who told you about the reports?" Vasquez asked. "Your analyst," she said. Dr. Chen. She was concerned that the Phase 2 threshold was limiting the Accord's training integration goals. She mentioned it during our pre-arrival briefing. He made a mental note to have a conversation with Dr. Chen. Then, he looked at the door again. The treaty required the Velthari delegation to participate in joint training exercises as a show of good faith, a symbolic gesture of military cooperation, documented and broadcast to both populations. What it didn't specify was which exercises. What it didn't limit was how far a diplomatic guest could go if they chose to go further. What it absolutely, clearly, and without ambiguity did not account for was a queen. "If I authorize this," Vasquez said, "you go as a paired unit. You follow my lead. If the system flags a critical biometric, we stop." "Agreed," she said immediately. "And, when this is over, you explain to me how a ceremonial queen knows military injury statistics and unpublished internal research reports." Her facial plates shifted again. The configuration he would later learn to read as something very close to a human smile. "When this is over," she said, "I will explain everything." She pressed her limb to the access panel. The door opened. The sound that came through it was not the mechanical hum of Phase 1. It was something deeper. Something that moved in the chest before it reached the ears. Phase 2 was a combat simulation floor. Real impact surfaces. Pressure resistance chambers. Kinetic response walls that hit back. The injury rate wasn't 47% because the equipment malfunctioned. It was 47% because the equipment worked exactly as designed and the human body had limits that were very easy to find if you pushed in the right direction. Vasquez walked through first. The Queen followed. Behind them, without orders, without permission, 12 human soldiers filed through the door. Private Dace went last, and the door sealed shut behind them, and the light shifted from white to the deep amber of active combat simulation. The floor began to move. Vasquez had been through Phase 2417 times. He knew its rhythms the way he knew his own heartbeat. He knew where the first kinetic wall activated. He knew the pressure sequence in the resistance chambers. He knew the exact moment the floor's acceleration peaked and the half-second window it created for repositioning. He watched Queen Velith walk into it for the first time. The first kinetic wall came from the left. Fast. Horizontal force at chest height. A trained soldier's response was to drop and roll, absorbing the impact across the shoulder rather than the torso. It was a technique that took most recruits 6 weeks to develop instinct for. The Queen didn't drop. She caught it. Her 2 upper right limbs extended and absorbed the kinetic wall's force the way a breakwater absorbs a wave, not by stopping it, but by redirecting it, channeling the energy down through her frame and into the floor. The compression plates registered a massive force transfer and adjusted accordingly, and she used that adjustment, that momentary softness in the floor's resistance, to pivot 90 degrees and face the second wall before it fired. The second wall fired. She was already sideways to it. The force passed through the space she had occupied half a second earlier. Vasquez stopped walking. The 12 soldiers behind him stopped. The simulation continued. The walls kept firing. The pressure chambers kept cycling. The floor kept moving. And Queen Velith kept navigating it, not with the precise tactical efficiency of a trained soldier, but with something older and more fundamental, a deep physical intelligence, an understanding of force and weight and momentum that felt less like training and more like memory. Like her body had always known how to do this. Like the only thing missing had been a flaw complicated enough to make it worth doing. Private Dace appeared at Vasquez's shoulder. "Sir," the private said quietly, "is she military?" "No," Vasquez said. "Has she ever trained?" "I don't know." The private watched the Queen move through a pressure chamber that had put 3 certified soldiers in medical the previous month. She moved through it without slowing. Her facial plates were arranged in an expression that Vasquez was beginning to recognize without the briefing materials. Focus. Pure, absolute focus. "She's done this before," Dace said. "Not a question." "Not this," Vasquez said. "Something like it." He pulled out his comm unit and sent a single message to Dr. Chen. Full background on the Queen. "Everything. Now." The response came back in 40 seconds. "Dear." Chen had apparently been waiting for exactly this message. The file was long. Vasquez scanned the top line. Then, he read it again. Queen Velith of the Velthari sovereignty was not a ceremonial leader. The title translated as Queen because that was the closest human equivalent, but the Velthari word, Velith, was also a rank. A military rank. The highest one. Held only by individuals who had survived the Velthari's own selection process, a process that had no human equivalent because humans had never needed to filter their leadership through 40 years of graduated physical and cognitive elimination. She was the Queen because she was the last one standing. Vasquez put the comm unit away. The simulation entered its final sequence, the kinetic response walls firing in overlapping patterns, the floor shifting to destabilize footing, the pressure chambers running simultaneous cycles. It was designed to overwhelm, to find the edge, to make even the most prepared soldier feel, for just a moment, that they had run out of room. Queen Velith stood in the center of it and became very still. Not frozen. Not overwhelmed. Still the way a blade is still before it moves. The walls fired. She moved through them like water through rock, not by force, but by finding the spaces between. The floor shifted. She shifted with it. The pressure chambers cycled. She breathed through them, her cardiovascular output dropping again, her body treating the most advanced human combat simulation as something approximately equal to a brisk walk. The simulation reached its conclusion. The amber lights returned to white. The walls retracted. The floor stabilized. Silence. Then, Private Dace started clapping. It was slow at first. Just the private, just the 2 hands, just the sound of one young soldier refusing to stay quiet about what they had just witnessed. Then, the soldier next to Dace joined. Then, the next. Then, all 12 of them, standing in the white light of Phase 2, producing the sound that humans make when they have seen something they did not believe was possible. Queen Velith turned to face them. Her facial plates moved through several configurations in rapid sequence, surprise, calculation, something that might have been emotion processing at a rate faster than her usual stillness allowed. Then, she settled on an expression that Vasquez had no briefing material for. He had never seen it before. He would later learn it was the Velthari expression for moved. She had not expected to be applauded. She had expected observation. assessment, perhaps wariness. These were the things her people had given her when she completed the Velthari selection process 40 years ago. Silence and evaluation, because those were the appropriate responses to watching your leader prove herself capable. She had not expected joy. Vasquez walked forward until he stood 3 meters from her. He stopped. He met her eyes, the 4 of them, arranged in a horizontal line above her facial plates, each one a deep amber color that had nothing to do with the lights and everything to do with biology. "Your Majesty," he said, "I owe you an apology." She tilted her head slightly. "For what?" "We were told you were a symbolic leader, a diplomatic figure, someone to be accommodated and managed." He paused. "We were briefed to treat this visit as a gesture, not a partnership." Her facial plate shifted. "I know." That was wrong. "Yes," she agreed. "It was." He extended his right hand. The human gesture for agreement and respect. She knew what it meant. She had studied human gestures the way she had apparently studied everything about humanity. Thoroughly. Without announcing it. She extended one of her upper right limbs and met his hand with the flat of her foremost joint. Not a perfect match for a human handshake. Something better. Something adapted. "Commander Vasquez," she said, "I came here because the treaty requires a gesture of good faith, a symbolic act of cooperation." She glanced at the training floor around them. "I stayed because this floor is the most honest thing I have encountered on your planet." He looked at her. "Honest." "It does not care who I am," she said. "It does not make accommodations for my rank. It measures what I can do and responds accordingly." She looked at the compression plates, the retracted walls, the pressure chambers. "I have spent 40 years surrounded by individuals who adjust their behavior based on what I represent. This floor adjusts based on what I am." Her facial plates settled into the expression he now knew meant recognition. "That is honesty." Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you read our unpublished reports?" he asked. "To find your way in here." "I read your unpublished reports," she said, "because I needed to understand whether humanity was ready for an honest partnership. The published materials tell me what you want me to believe. The unpublished ones tell me what you actually think." She paused. "Your injury reduction research tells me your people are trying to solve problems they haven't announced yet. That is a very good sign." Private Dace, who had been listening from 3 meters back with the focused intensity of someone storing every word for later, spoke without thinking. "Are we," the private asked, "ready for a real partnership?" Every head turned. Vasquez opened his mouth to say something about protocol, about rank, about the 17 different ways a private should not be asking questions of a foreign head of state in an active simulation facility. Queen Velith raised one limb slightly. Just slightly. The gesture that Vasquez was starting to recognize as permission. She looked at Private Dace for a long moment. The same long moment she had given the private's first question, back on Phase 1, before she had walked through the door marked Phase TWO without waiting for an answer. This time, she answered. "You are closer than you know," she said. "And further than you pretend." She held the private's gaze. "But you ask honest questions, even when you should stay quiet." The expression on her facial plates deepened into something complex and warm. "In my experience, that is where every real partnership begins." The lights in Phase 2 returned to their rest state. The simulation systems powered down. The floor went still and flat and quiet beneath all of them. Outside, in the Northern Compound's administrative wing, the diplomatic teams were preparing for the afternoon's scheduled events. Handshakes, speeches, carefully worded statements of cooperation designed to look like progress while committing to nothing specific. Inside Phase 2, a queen and a commander stood across from each other in the honest silence of a floor that had tested both of them and found them adequate, while 12 soldiers stood at attention without being asked and one private waited for a future that had just, quietly, without announcement, changed shape. The treaty would be signed in 4 days. It would hold for 60 years. Historians would later argue about why, about political timing, economic incentives, the careful architecture of the unified Accords language. They would write papers about the diplomatic groundwork and the strategic advantages for both species and the brilliant negotiating teams on either side. None of them would mention Phase 2. None of them would mention a private who asked a queen if something hurt, and a queen who walked through the wrong door because she had read the right reports, and a commander who extended his hand when he could have extended his authority instead. None of them would mention the flaw. But Queen Velith would. In her own records, in the Velthari Sovereignty's official archive, in the section reserved for moments that the Queen had determined were historically significant enough to preserve in her own words, she wrote about the day she stepped onto a human training floor and felt, for the first time since the Karanis incident, that the two species might be capable of something more than careful distance. She wrote about the compression plates. She wrote about the kinetic walls. She wrote, at some length, about a young human named Dace who had asked 2 questions that no protocol permitted and had thereby done more for the unified accord than 12 months of formal negotiation. And, at the end of her entry, she wrote 1 sentence that her archivists would argue about for generations, uncertain whether it was metaphor or military assessment or something that resisted the categories they had been trained to use. The floor did not break, she wrote. Neither did they. I decided that was enough.